The late summer of 865 AD witnessed one of the most transformative military campaigns in English history, when a massive Viking coalition force, estimated at approximately 3,000 warriors, landed on the windswept shores of the Isle of Thanet in Kent, with a unified purpose that would shake the foundations of Anglo-Saxon Britain to their very core. This force was known as the Great Heathen Army, a coalition of Scandinavian warriors from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, and unlike the scattered raiding parties that had terrorized English coastlines for nearly 80 years, these Norse invaders had come not merely to plunder and retreat across the North Sea with their ill-gotten treasures, but to conquer, occupy, and rule the fragmented kingdoms that comprised what the locals called Englaland. The force was led by three legendary figures whose names would become synonymous with Viking military prowess. Halfdan Ragnarsson, a battle-hardened commander known for his tactical brilliance and ruthless efficiency in combat. Ivar the Boneless, whose unusual epithet has puzzled historians for centuries, with theories ranging from a physical condition that made his bones unusually flexible to a reference to his cunning nature that allowed him to slip through enemy defenses like a serpent. And Ubba, a fierce warrior whose reputation for ferocity in battle was matched only by his skill in naval warfare and coastal operations. These three commanders, possibly brothers according to Norse sagas, though the historical evidence remains ambiguous, had assembled their coalition through a combination of personal charisma, promises of wealth and land, and the shared ambition to carve out permanent kingdoms in the rich territories of England rather than settling for the temporary spoils of summer raiding seasons. The timing of this invasion was deliberate and strategically brilliant, as the Viking commanders recognized that England's division into four major kingdoms, Northumbria in the north, East Anglia in the east, Mercia in the Midlands, and Wessex in the south, along with numerous smaller territories and sub-kingdoms, created a fractured defensive system where no single Anglo-Saxon king commanded sufficient military resources to repel a coordinated invasion of this magnitude, and where ancient rivalries and competing territorial claims prevented the kind of unified resistance that might have stopped the Norse advance before it could gain momentum. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, that invaluable historical record compiled by monks and scribes across England in monasteries that would themselves soon face the Viking onslaught, designated this Norse coalition force with a term that reflected both their numbers and their pagan beliefs in the eyes of Christian England. The Misl-Heathen here, or Great Heathen Army, a name that has echoed through history as one of the most formidable military forces ever assembled during the Viking Age, a period spanning roughly from 793 to 1066 AD, when Scandinavian warriors ranged across Europe, the Mediterranean, and even into the Middle East and North America. For the primarily Saxon inhabitants of Britain, who had endured decades of summer raids on coastal monasteries like Lindisfarne, sacked in 793 in an attack that shocked Christian Europe, and trading settlements where Viking longships could beach, disgorge their warriors, and retreat to sea before any meaningful military response could be organized. The arrival of this massive force represented an existential threat unlike anything their kingdoms had previously faced, a realization that would prove tragically accurate as the Viking campaign unfolded with devastating efficiency over the following 14 years, fundamentally altering the political map of Britain and creating cultural and linguistic changes that remain visible in modern England more than 11 centuries later. The warriors who comprised this great army were not the desperate pirates of popular imagination, driven to sea by overpopulation and barren Scandinavian farmlands, but rather experienced fighters drawn from across Scandinavia, many of whom had previously campaigned in Francia, where Charlemagne's heirs struggled to defend their fractious empire against repeated Norse incursions, and where Viking commanders had perfected the art of extracting enormous tribute payments known as danegeld from terrified monarchs, while simultaneously honing their skills in siege warfare, the conquest of fortified settlements, and the political manipulation of divided kingdoms whose rulers could be played against each other with devastating effect. These men traveled not in the sleek longships of coastal raids, those shallow-drafted vessels capable of navigating up rivers and retreating rapidly to open water that have become iconic symbols of the Viking Age, but in a mixture of vessels including substantial numbers of Norse, the cargo ships of Norse seafaring culture that sacrificed speed for carrying capacity and could transport not only warriors, but also their horses, weapons, armor, supplies, portable forges for weapon repair, and the accumulated plunder and tribute that would finance their extended campaign deep in the English interior. The decision to bring horses, either transported from Scandinavia or acquired immediately upon landing through purchase or seizure, represented a revolutionary shift in Viking military tactics, as mounted warriors could conduct rapid strategic movements across the English countryside with devastating effect, covering distances in days that would take weeks on foot, striking targets far from navigable waterways where previous Viking raids had been concentrated, and pursuing retreating Anglo-Saxon forces with a speed that made orderly withdrawal nearly impossible, transforming the Vikings from raiders dependent on rivers and coastlines into a mobile field army capable of operating anywhere in England, regardless of terrain or distance. From their ships, the initial strategic moves of the Great Heathen Army demonstrated the sophisticated military thinking that would characterize their entire campaign, as they recognized that success in conquering England required not just battlefield victories, but the systematic subjugation of kingdoms through a combination of overwhelming force, strategic deception, political manipulation, and the ruthless exploitation of Anglo-Saxon political divisions, internal rivalries, and the lack of any unified command structure that might have coordinated an effective pan-English response to the invasion. Upon landing in Kent, the southernmost kingdom that served as England's gateway to continental Europe, the Vikings immediately extracted danegeld from the terrified local population, accepting substantial payments in gold and silver in exchange for promises of peace and safe passage, then systematically breaking those promises and ravaging eastern Kent with fire and sword anyway, burning settlements, seizing additional plunder, and demonstrating to the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that Norse oaths meant nothing, and that payment of tribute would buy only temporary respite rather than genuine security. A pattern of tactical deceit that would become their hallmark throughout the invasion and would eventually make negotiation with the Vikings nearly impossible, as English kings learned that any agreement would be honored only as long as it suited Viking interests. Rather than attempting to conquer Wessex immediately, despite it being the wealthiest and most powerful of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms under the strong leadership of King Ethelwulf and his warrior sons, who would eventually include Alfred the Great, the Vikings instead demonstrated their strategic acumen by moving northeast into East Anglia, a smaller and militarily weaker kingdom whose ruler, King Edmund, made the catastrophic decision to provide the invaders with horses for their campaign, in return for promises of peace, a decision that would prove fatal both for Edmund personally and for his kingdom's independence, while simultaneously providing the Vikings with the mounted mobility that would transform their entire campaign and make them exponentially more dangerous to every kingdom in England. The Vikings established winter quarters at Thetford in East Anglia during 865–866, but this was not a period of rest and recuperation as might have been expected after a summer of raiding and movement. Instead, the Norse commanders used these months for intensive military planning, gathering detailed intelligence about the political situation throughout England, but particularly in Northumbria, where civil war between rival claimants to the throne had weakened the kingdom's defensive capabilities at precisely the moment when unity would have been essential to resist the coming onslaught, and where ancient tribal divisions and personal feuds among the Northumbrian nobility created vulnerabilities that Viking spies and informants could identify and exploit. Archaeological evidence from Thetford reveals that these winter encampments were substantial fortified settlements rather than temporary camps, with defensive earthworks, organized internal layouts suggesting military discipline and planning, and evidence of metalworking activities, including weapon repair and manufacture, indicating that the Vikings were preparing for sustained military operations rather than seasonal raiding. In November 866, as winter began to grip England and Anglo-Saxon military forces traditionally demobilized for the season, the Great Heathen Army launched their assault on Northumbria, marching north with their newly acquired horses in a rapid movement that caught the divided Northumbrian kingdom completely unprepared, and capturing York, the major city in the Kingdom of Northumbria, and the former Roman fortress city of Eboracum, in a lightning strike that demonstrated both the speed, enabled by mounted warfare, and the complete intelligence superiority the Vikings had established through their months of careful reconnaissance and information gathering. The Vikings would rename this city Jorvik, and it would become the beating heart of Scandinavian power in Britain for more than a century, eventually evolving into one of medieval Europe's major urban centers, where Norse and Anglo-Saxon cultures would blend to create new forms of art, commerce, and social organization that would influence the development of northern England for centuries to come. The capture of York represented far more than a military victory or the seizure of an important urban center. It provided the Vikings with a secure operational base in northern England that could serve as a logistics hub and safe haven throughout their campaign, access to established trade routes connecting Britain to Scandinavia and continental Europe that could provide reinforcements and supplies from the Norse homelands, control of the rich agricultural lands of the Vale of York that could feed their army and provide tribute to finance continued operations, and possession of a city whose ancient Roman walls and strategic position on the River Ouse made it nearly impregnable to counterattack by any force the divided Anglo-Saxon kingdoms could muster. The Northumbrian response to this invasion was catastrophically hampered by internal divisions, as the rival kings Ella and Osbert, each claiming legitimate right to the Northumbrian throne, and each commanding loyal factions among the nobility, struggled to overcome their mutual hatred and unite their forces against the common enemy that now occupied their kingdom's most important city. A delay that the Vikings exploited with characteristic ruthlessness by strengthening York's defenses, sending raiding parties throughout Northumbria to seize supplies and treasure, and allowing time for word of their success to spread throughout England, demoralizing potential resistance in other kingdoms. When the Northumbrians finally assembled a combined army and attempted to recapture York on 21st March 867. Their assault concluded in decisive and catastrophic defeat for Anglo-Saxon forces, with both Ella and Osbert killed in the battle along with much of the Northumbrian nobility and military leadership. A loss so complete that it not only eliminated both claimants to the Northumbrian throne, but also effectively ended the kingdom's existence as an independent Anglo-Saxon realm capable of organized resistance to Viking occupation. According to Norse sagas composed centuries later, though historians vigorously debate their historical accuracy and suspect substantial legendary embellishment, the death of King Ella was particularly gruesome, as Ivar the Boneless allegedly subjected him to the blood eagle, a horrific execution method that involved cutting the ribs away from the spine and pulling the lungs out through the back to create a grotesque resemblance to wings, supposedly in revenge for Ella's earlier execution of the legendary Viking hero Ragnar Lothbrok by throwing him into a pit of serpents. though modern scholars increasingly question whether this legendary connection between Ragnar, Ivar, and Ella had any basis in historical fact, or was instead a later literary invention designed to provide dramatic motivation for the invasion and to connect the historical Great Heathen Army to the popular legendary cycles surrounding the semi-mythical figure of Ragnar Lothbrok. Regardless of the truth behind these legendary accounts, the Battle of York in 867 represented a catastrophic turning point for Anglo-Saxon England, as one of the four major kingdoms had been effectively destroyed in a single afternoon's fighting, its military forces shattered, its leadership eliminated, and its political independence ended, leaving Northumbria as an occupied territory under Viking control, where Scandinavian jarls and their warriors would settle permanently, intermarry with the surviving Anglo-Saxon population, and create a hybrid Norse-English culture that would define northern England's character for generations to come. Following their conquest of Northumbria, the Great Heathen Army demonstrated the methodical, patient approach that would characterize their systematic dismantling of Anglo-Saxon England, moving from kingdom to kingdom with a strategic patience that allowed them to consolidate each conquest, extract maximum tribute, and establish secure bases before advancing to the next target, while simultaneously preventing their enemies from forming effective military coalitions or coordinating strategic responses that might have overwhelmed even the formidable Viking forces. In 867, fresh from their triumph at York, and now firmly established in the conquered territories of Northumbria, the Viking army marched south into Mercia, one of the most powerful and historically significant Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, whose rulers had once dominated much of England during the 8th century under powerful kings like Offa, who had built the famous dyke marking the Welsh border and established winter quarters at Nottingham, where they constructed substantial fortifications and challenged the Mercian king Burgred to attempt dislodging them if he possessed the military capability and courage to do so. The Mercians, recognizing the magnitude of the threat and having witnessed the catastrophic fate that had befallen Northumbria, took the unprecedented step of requesting military assistance from their southern neighbors and sometime rivals in Wessex, resulting in a joint Mercian West Saxon army that marched to Nottingham and besieged the Viking fortifications throughout the winter of 867-868, yet despite their numerical superiority and the combination of forces from two major kingdoms, the combined Anglo-Saxon forces proved unable to overcome the Viking defensive positions, break through the fortifications, or force a decisive battle on terms favorable to the attackers, demonstrating that the Vikings had mastered not only offensive warfare and mounted raiding, but also the arts of fortification and defensive combat. Eventually, recognizing that the siege was failing and that maintaining their combined army through winter was logistically difficult and politically complex given the traditional rivalry between their kingdoms, the Mercians agreed to terms with the Viking army, paying substantial tribute in exchange for the Vikings' withdrawal back to York for the winter of 868-869. A tactical retreat that demonstrated the Vikings' willingness to accept payment and temporary withdrawal when faced with superior forces or unfavorable military situations, while maintaining their strategic flexibility for future operations and avoiding the risk of a decisive defeat that might have shattered their army and ended their conquest before it had truly begun. The pattern of Viking strategy was now unmistakably clear to observers throughout England. The Great Heathen Army would penetrate deep into Anglo-Saxon territory during the campaigning season, establish fortified winter camps that could serve as bases for further operations, and that were positioned to threaten multiple kingdoms simultaneously, ruthlessly exploit political divisions and military weakness wherever they appeared, accept tribute and temporary withdrawal when convenient or strategically advantageous, and systematically conquer and occupy territory whenever opportunity presented itself, a methodology that proved devastatingly effective against the fragmented Anglo-Saxon kingdoms whose rulers could not overcome their traditional rivalries and coordinate an effective pan-English response to this existential threat to their civilization. In 869, the Great Heathen Army returned to East Anglia, the kingdom that had initially provided them with horses and supplies in what had proven to be a futile attempt to purchase peace and safety through cooperation with the invaders, and launched a campaign of conquest that culminated in the capture, torture, and execution of King Edmund, who would later be venerated throughout medieval Christendom as Edmund the Martyr after reportedly refusing to renounce his Christian faith and submit to pagan overlords, choosing death over apostasy in a demonstration of religious conviction that inspired countless later accounts, though historical sources differ significantly on the precise circumstances of his death, with some claiming he was tied to a tree, shot with arrows, and then beheaded, while others suggest different methods of execution, all agreeing only that his death was deliberate, public, and intended as both punishment and warning. Archaeological evidence from Thetford and surrounding areas reveals the substantial scale of Viking winter encampments, with remains suggesting that these were not temporary raiding bases or simple military camps, but rather substantial installations with organized layouts, defensive earthworks, storage facilities for supplies and plunder, stabling areas for hundreds of horses, and separate residential zones that could house thousands of warriors along with their weapons, equipment, and the portable wealth accumulated through years of conquest and tribute extraction, effectively transforming the Vikings from raiders dependent on quick strikes and rapid retreat into an army of occupation with the logistical infrastructure necessary for sustained military operations far from their Scandinavian homelands. The year 871 marked a pivotal and ominous moment in the invasion when the Great Heathen Army was substantially reinforced by another Danish force known as the Great Summer Army, led by the formidable Viking commander Guthrum, whose name would become synonymous with Viking military power in England, and who would prove to be one of Alfred the Great's most dangerous and persistent adversaries, substantially increasing the overall Viking forces at precisely the moment when they turned their full attention southward toward Wessex, the last major unconquered Anglo-Saxon kingdom and the realm where they would finally meet sustained and effective resistance that would ultimately prevent the complete Viking conquest of England.